All right, for this week's project, we're going to look at reshaping the landscape. I'm going to do a very quick sort of talk to introduce the concept and the themes that you guys will be working with this week and a half long project. Keep in mind, I'm aware it's a week and a half long project. There's a lot to go over, and basically, importantly, just like we did with the carousel unit, I want you to look at the theme of the sublime in the context of the landscape when designing your projects. So we're going to look at why we're focusing on the landscape, what is the sublime, the elements of the landscape, some methods and strategy you guys can use in your projects, and outcomes. So to start off, the first image I'm showing you here is The World and Others Like This by Drew Nikovitz. Now, this piece here is a photographer capturing the landscape, but this landscape is in the context of a computer game. So when we're thinking about this project, I don't want you to just take traditional looks at what is landscape photography, what is the landscape in the context of film and animation. It's about ways of exploring things in perhaps unconventional means. So we're looking at what's often written off as a background and focusing on it as the foreground. Finding the beauty in the mundane and understanding out the landscape we're looking at. It's about how we're being alone in the landscape and how that affects our perception of a place. It's about seeing things through the gaze of a filmmaker, animator, games designer, a photographer. Our landscape is altered, especially here in England. We've lived here for millennia, and every bit of landscape here has been touched or altered by our inhabitants. We have aesthetic ideas about what the landscape is, and particularly what it goes back to about the 1800s in the idea of romanticism, and how it's informed what we view and interpret as a landscape in the context of photography and painting. Once again, you see here another work that's a really non-traditional context and and it is an installation of landscape, but it is still in that context of photography. So we're looking at the landscape, and honestly, we usually dismiss landscape paintings and things and stuff Nan has above the fridge in the lounge, the sofa in the lounge. So it's about, what is it and why is it key to all of the areas of lens-based? And if we have a strong understanding of that, we can use this when applying it to things like when we're designing worlds and environments for games, when we're looking at placing our characters into surreal spaces. We use this when we're trying to location scout to create themes and moods for our films. And in photography, the landscape can be a subject that is revisited and rethought and reworked for generations. And I think every generation has a new take on what is landscape in the context of photography, film, animation, games. So we're looking at sort of the three ways of classically interpreting landscapes: the pastoral, the picturesque, and the sublime. This here is a picture by Thomas Cole. It's known as the Oxbow, and it's a location in the United States of the Connecticut River where it forms that sort of arch. You can see here, this is a picturesque version of the landscape. You're looking at the landscape from a high vantage point, and you've got a clear view of the world around you. We like this. It's slightly dramatic. There's a thunderstorm clearing, but there's clear skies ahead. When we're looking at landscape, we're looking at sort of the idea of the ideal world. In traditional sort of pastoral landscapes, that means there's a secure environment. It's pleasing to look at because everybody is doing all right. The nature is a comforting source of physical and spiritual sustenance. The farmland, the fields are all full of wheat. The cows and sheep are all fat. It's basically a reference to mankind's ability to control the natural world. The natural world in a pastoral landscape is under control, and it's full of abundance. And usually in these, you've got cows, and people who are in it are normally farmhands or milkmaids, and everybody in these landscapes is living an idealized life. You'll see this in particular instance of playing with the pastoral in games like Everyone Has Gone to the Rapture. It's looking at this beautiful landscape, but the fact that nobody's in it. Whereas the picturesque, in response to the pastoral, the picturesque is a beautiful, natural, untouched landscape. It is things like mountaintops and riverbeds. If there are elements of architecture, it's normally classical ruins, like in this painting here. People in it are often gazing off into the landscape. This would be some place where somebody would take a selfie now. It's usually a scenic spot. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about the picturesque landscape. In response to both of those is the sublime. The sublime is, as articulated by Edmund Burke in his philosophical inquiry to the origins of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, refers to the thrill and danger of confronting untamed nature and its overwhelming forces, such as thunderstorms and deep chasms. In the sublime, nature is fierce. It is awesome. It is going to destroy your ship. It's going to drown its crew in violence, like we see here in J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship. The sublime, on the other hand, shows how nature is most fearsome. Burke believed that terror, in all cases, the ruling principle of the sublime, that nature is destructive. Burke refers that there is an awe and reverence to the wild and violent passion. Kant, on the other hand, in his reference to the sublime, believes that nature is awesome, but it isn't always about the fear of nature. It is in awe of the power of nature. We see the sublime in films like the David Attenborough films, Our Planet, where nature is beautiful and fierce, where animals are roaming the Saharas and plains, where glaciers are breaking apart. It's the idea that man's scale in the context of nature is small, that we as a singular being are small in nature. You have here Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above the Sea and Fog. This is a typical sort of setting of what people used to do in the 1800s. In the 1800s, men of a certain class, and it's normally men, would go off on what's called the Grand Tour. And rich, wealthy men would wander around Europe. Basically a classy gap year where they'd go about to possibly Italy, maybe if they're lucky, Greece. They'd look at the landscape. They'd take awe in the classical structures and the ruins of the great men that came from the past, and they'd stare off into the vista and contemplate their place in the world, because when they'd go back, they'd be lords of their manors. And then they'd always plunder and steal a bunch of artifacts and take it back home with them. But that's a different point. So we have here Caspar David Friedrich, the pinnacle sort of idea that the wanderer, this middle class to upper class man with his walking stick, is standing at the top of this hill and looking at the vastness in front of him. He's looking off into nature, but at the same time, he's looking off to the future, which is what you can interpret in some landscapes. So in the sublime, man is influenced and inspired by the landscape he is in. Or woman. We're not going to be, but you know what I mean. Talk about the 1800s, it's a bunch of white dudes. So, humanity is still the important front, yeah? But it's going to be the sort of crazy raging rivers, the dizzying cliffs and canyons, ferocious animals, violent storms. That's what we're looking at in sublime imagery. And that's to kind of look at, is your scale. Yeah? And with the sublime, we can turn this on the head. The sublime doesn't have to necessarily be man's impact on nature. It could be, and you could interpret it as man's impact on nature, and the fact that we are over conquering nature and destroying nature. So you could take that and look at a theme called the Anthropocene, which is sort of the world after man, after we've destroyed everything. What is left and how can we interpret that? So you can take it as the awesomeness of nature, or a modern spin would be how we've destroyed nature. Yeah? So, the sublime in the context of lens-based. If you haven't seen The Revenant yet, The Revenant is a film that is really about the sublime. It is about the power and fierceness of nature. And that's what filmmakers did. They look at the ideas of the 1800s of these sort of classical paintings and think about how they take that into photography and animation. And look at how that can influence game designs and illustrations. We have to look at ideas of the past to inform the context we're making now. So this project is going to give the nod to these old masters, but to inform a new piece of work that stands on its own. Yeah. So I want you guys to look at these sort of classical paintings, but then look at modern people who've taken inspiration from it and put your own spin on it. So capture the sublime. So if we're going to look at creating our own sublime imagery, we're going to put people small in the landscape. So here we've got a scene from Fantasia. It's a beautiful sort of image where the people are quite small. You've got sort of these beautiful cathedral-esque trees. The landscape is an imposing force, but it can be imposing in an awesome, beautiful way. Yeah? There's something untamed or foreboding about the landscape. Not welcoming, but a challenge. It's dark. Yeah? These people are going off into the night. Think about color. Last week we thought about black and white, but think about how color influences landscape and how we read a landscape. The color of these clouds, for example, here in Andrei Tarkovsky's Polaroid, and the redness of the roof, and the blue hues of the early dawn. This can really affect how we interpret it, read, and feel about a landscape. Think about how colors are peaceful and harmonious, and which ones are sort of foreboding and mysterious. Think about saturation and contrast of the colors as well. This is a very muted palette, and the colors are kind of desaturated in elements because of the mist. So think about those elements when you are thinking about your palette, when you're drawing, or when you're editing your photos, or doing color corrections to your films. Try a new perspective. So we got Awiosa van der Molen and her works here. And it's about her sort of process of way she documents this work. It's not a meditation exactly, but the state of mind occurs when you're very open to the landscape. That moment when your mind slows down on its own. So it's about sort of taking a long walk and just absorbing the landscape until your mind just clears itself of the modern world and you just start seeing the world around you and just taking in and being present in the moment. You want to remove yourself is kind of her idea, that you're not thinking about, oh, I've got to do this project, I've got to do this, I've got this going on. It's just about just seeing the world around you, and all you're doing is thinking about what you're seeing and being very, very present and in the moment if you want to try this approach to capturing a landscape. Think about locations you can visit. Luckily, we live in Kent, and I know we like to give Kent a hard time, but Kent has had some lovely and diverse areas to look at for inspiration. Yeah? You need to find your own inspiration. Look at your surroundings like Turner did. Yeah? Explore areas, look at the beauty of the mundane. Everybody's gone to the Rapture. They picked the English countryside for a reason. Yeah? So think of sort of Kingswood near Ashford, the Westgate Park in Canterbury, Blean Wood, Samphire Hoe, Knoll, the White Cliffs, Dungeness, Isles of Sheppey, the Medway. Yeah? Think about what areas we might see every day and we might overlook, but really think about it from almost an outsider's perspective on the area that we know and maybe have grown up in and spent our whole lives in. Or if it's new to you, go someplace new, go someplace you rarely ever visit, and give that sort of fresh perspective to the landscape. And once again, through all of this, socially distancing of, paying attention to social guidelines and COVID recommendations from the government. So methods and strategies. Go for a walk with a camera and a sketchbook. Yeah? Spend time in isolation or in pairs in these spots and see it for the details and the big picture. Take your time. Take notes on the sounds and feelings that the landscape evokes. Explore somewhere new or somewhere familiar. Look at the history of the place. Think of the people who've been there before, what they saw in the landscape. Why did people settle in Canterbury? What is it about this hill? Why is there a farm there? How long has there been a farm there? Yeah? Think about that and think about where we build roads in a landscape, how the landscape flows, the lines on the streets. We've got an image here from Brassai. Listen, it's November. It gets dark early. And if you're looking at dark nighttime photography of a city street, you got to look at Brassai. He took beautiful long exposure photos of Paris in the 1930s, and he really captured the sense and the feel for the city at that time. He captured that moment in his landscape, in his environment. So if you're doing photography, you're responsible for your own kit. There are 8 35mm cameras, 10 1200D DSLR cameras, 6 medium format cameras. You can shoot color, black or white, shoot 35 or medium format. Ask me for film. I'm happy to provide it. You can work with digital or analog. Yeah? Take time and sketch and plan your location. And look at how Ansel Adams and how he sort of planned his shoots. Ansel Adams, you can't talk about landscape photography without mentioning him. He saw landscape photography as a high art form. In a time when everybody else was doing street photography, he focused on the landscape to a detriment in a sense. But he got these beautiful images because he practiced a technique known as visualization. And what Ansel Adams saw visualization is seeing the final photograph in your mind's eye, knowing it's going to be black and white, it's going to be high contrast, I'm going to have everything in super focus. Because if you understand what the picture is you're about to take, it's going to change your camera settings. If I want to have everything beautifully sharp and in focus, like in the image there on the right, I need to have a very small aperture, which means I'm going to have a longer shutter speed. So you can see it's a longer shutter speed because the clouds, which are moving dramatically, are slightly blurred. The waterfall there is blurry, so it's a longer exposure shot. He's waited and gone at the time for the right light. Yeah? Think about it, he really understood his film stock and his ISO. He wasn't shooting all the time. He spent time thinking about the image and his composition and what his settings were before taking that final picture. He'd hike up for hours with just 2 or 3 plates on his camera to take a photograph. Yeah? Think about a photo as being a precious thing and not something we discard quickly. Start thinking like this and take notes of what your exposure triangle is. Read the light meter, understand those settings of the camera, because the instant you understand those, you're going to be a much better photographer. For your outcomes, process and develop and edit your photos and think of your presentation. Your presentation doesn't have to be standard. It can be something a bit experimental. Like, I know, I will see what I've seen before here by Thomas Aldorf. Literally, turning the landscape on its side. Yeah? Putting in glitches. Yeah? Present your work on a final A2 sheet. Use the print bureau to print out your work on photographic paper. For the love of God, I don't want to see anything off of the MDF printers. It's not going to give you a good photograph. Use proper printing. Yeah? Be sure to put thumbnails, contact sheets, annotations in your sketchbooks. Write about how you envisioned and reimagined the landscape based on these classical interpretations with your modern spin. And complete 3 artist research. 2 from the list and not 2 from the trip, but took a slide from an older thing, and 1 classical. Yeah, that's the 3. Yeah. Film pathway. Here's Barry Lyndon by Kubrick. He took a lot of inspiration from classical Constable-esque landscape paintings for Barry Lyndon, and same thing. You are going to treat this like your location scanning. Take in the landscape, see what you want to explore in the landscape as documentarian or more abstractly, or develop a narrative based on your locations, the landscape you're filming. Yeah, film several hours of footage, take lots of images, build a narrative. Consider using time-lapse or hyperlapse techniques to capture movement of the clouds and the feel of the light, perhaps maybe the way the shadows move or the tides come in. When you're back, you're tasked with turning your footage into a film or installation. Yeah, so think about how you might present this landscape. Location scouting is a major role in filmmaking, and finding the right location to film is important. So think about where you could go. There's some incredibly familiar and well-used sites around Kent for films. You might know that Strawberry Fields was filmed in Knoll House. The landscape itself was looking and playing with the idea of the pastoral, picturesque landscape. Yeah? Look at filmmakers like Tarkovsky, who used all sorts of crazy locations in Russia, Kubrick, who was so much about finding the right location, and look at the idea of slow film and capturing the landscape. So, slow film, or slow cinema. Look at somebody like John Benning, Slow cinema is a genre of art film making and emphasizing long takes, and is often minimalist, observational, with little or no narrative, and can be described as contemplative cinema. You go there and you watch the tide rising. This is Casting Glances from 2007, and this is based on a landscape artist who created what's known as a spiral jet. And this is filming you sit there and you watch the tide come in. The jet is really hard to get to, so it's the idea that you're there and you're watching something and you're just lost in the small movements, the little ripples of water, the clouds passing. Film doesn't always have to have a really crazy narrative. Slow cinema is about slowing things down and almost like a living, live window to someplace. So that's the idea of slow cinema. Look at something like Man with a Movie Camera. The Soviets were all about filming on location, and they thought that cinema shot in a studio was untrue to the world around it. And Man with a Movie Camera is just a bunch of guys going off with their movie camera and filming 5 Russian cities over the course of the year and then cutting it into the context of a single film. Yeah? And setting it to some crazy stressful music. So the idea that you could use montage and create a scene and a mood just through editing, of a location and just filming lots of stuff and just putting it to music. Yeah? There's 1200D DSLR cameras, there's 6 GoPros, especially if you're doing time-lapse, the GoPros are brilliant for that. There's Zoom recorders for recording audio. Ask me how to use one, I'll happily show you. You can shoot on the cameras, but also with your phones. There's gimbals, which are little steady cams now available for your phones. I don't want to see just everybody walking in the woods and filming their woods. So think about what your shots are. Yeah? Film outcomes. Maybe you want a storyboard or write up a plan, a short film or video installation based on your trip to your location. Choose to present it as an installation in the room or as a film. Yeah? I want it at 24 frames per second so it feels more like film. Yeah? 25 is a modern setting, but if you get rid of a frame, it does feel slightly slower. Yeah? Look at Stalker and Tarkovsky. The landscape in Stalker actually killed Tarkovsky in the end. He lost all of his film stock from his first shoot. He had to reshoot, and some of the sites he was filming in were toxic. Some of the locations he went to were full of toxic dust, and it's believed he got cancer from one of the locations that ended up killing him. So he's not the most aspirational filmmaker because he takes way too many risks in his filmmaking, but there's a beautiful sort of self-deprivation to his work. And his work is kind of that fine line between art house cinema and actually what cinema is. And by looking at somebody like Tarkovsky, he is the anti-Kubrick. He was very well aware of what Kubrick was making, and a lot of his films are in response to the clean, beautiful things that Kubrick was making. He would make the grimier Soviet version of that. So he's a really interesting filmmaker to look at. And Stalker, he plays around with color. It's about the idea that there's this fallout land that he goes to and he guides people into, and that the real world's monochromatic. So the beauty is in this weird sort of desolate place, and you can look at things sort of the idea of people who visit sites like Chernobyl, and people who go there to check out Chernobyl. This is what he was doing before Chernobyl happened. He was going to these desolate places, but using it as context for his sci-fi films. Put together like a little location guide of your still images from your shots and things, maybe a map of your trip if that's relevant, on an A2 sheet, sorry I mistyped there, and show how your film sort of came together. Complete 2 artist research from the list. Sorry, once again, I mistyped here. 3 artist research, 2 from your contemporary ones, and 1 from the sort of historical research, And the essay bit there, you can totally ignore that. Sorry, that's from an older thing. I'll revise. So, for you animators and games designers, it's going to be about drawing on location and getting some evidence in your sketchbooks to take away and take home as parts of your animation. So it's going to be to look at sort of ways of documenting your location and creating some doodles on site. We spend so much time drawing from flat images. It's very different when we draw on location. Yeah, check your compositions and proportions when you're drawing. This is something we're going to explore in the workshop today. Taking rubbings, making quick watercolors, bringing colored pencils, collage. Draw the plants individually from the landscape. Look at the movement and see how the clouds move. Are they fluffy clouds? Are they moving fast? They're not looking like they're moving at all. How the leaves blow in the wind, perhaps a train or cars passing in the distance. What does that actually look like? How do I draw and interpret movement? Animation pathway. Draw some more. Yeah, fill a sketchbook if you have to. Yeah, capture movements, plants, animals, machines, and motions. Take video recordings for rotoscoping a source material for your animation. Then you can come back and look at your materials to create a short animation. Look at the concept of ma, which comes from Studio Ghibli, and it's about sort of a character having a moment of introspection, looking at the landscape and taking it in, at a moment of just breathing and taking in a space. Yeah, especially if it's gorgeous space. Look at this beautiful concept art here from Ratatouille. You can do sketches and stuff on your tablets and things if that's something you want to explore as well, if you are a digital drawer through and through. Animation outcomes, loads of observational drawings, yeah, especially the landscape you've chosen. A final animation based on boils, rotoscoping, panning across the landscape. You kind of pick, after you've done some of the workshops, what sort of little animation it does. And it doesn't have to be very, very long. It can be very short, yeah? Just a quick little sense of something like a loop, yeah? If the animation doesn't have to be narrative, it just needs to be a recording of a space or emotion of the environment, yeah? So maybe it's just this with her dress blowing, yeah? And the little blades of grass moving. Maybe that's all it is. Yeah, that's all it needs to be. Games design pathway. Loads of observational drawings. Yeah, develop a map or a board for a game based on your location. Taking the elements that interest you and convert them into your own game design. Game designers around the world are constantly looking at their locations as influence for their games. Last of Us, heavily based on actual locations in Boston. I grew up outside of Boston. I play Last of Us. It's great. It looks just like parts of the city in an apocalypse, which some of the city looks like. You know, so it's really fun. And that sort of realism and little elements, little things like the way the lights look. Like that's the way those lights look on that street corner. Yeah. There's something about that that makes it fun because people who know that space can play that. Take inspiration from your landscape and transform into game. Yeah. It could be just a background painting. Yeah. In games design, landscapes have become more complex, more dimensional, more like actual places. So it's important to understand and study actual places and actual rock formations because it makes the world feel more realistic. Justin Barry uses composites of screen captures from war-inspired video games like Last of Us to capture a moment. For example, he runs around these video games and then basically acts as a landscape photographer and captures a single tree on the landscape there, even though he might be playing, this looks like Call of Duty. Playing Call of Duty and taking a picture, yeah? Or Assassin's Creed Valhalla. You can go to London in Valhalla, like Viking times, and you can run around the streets there and you can explore it, and somebody's thought of what London would look like when the Vikings lived there, or if the Vikings lived there. So it's quite interesting what you can do. So it's a quite uncanny appearing from both a hyperreal and sort of telling signs of fantasy. These landscapes are natural, there's something too clean about them, but that's what's interesting about games design, is that you're creating these super realistic environments that are based on real places. Think about how we use maps in games. You might plan a map for your own environment. Think about how the player might experience the environment. Is the map known? Why is the map not known? Maybe parts of the map are revealed depending on player movement, or maybe it's like a racetrack and you need to know where the left turns are and the right turns are. How do we read maps? What elements should they have? We'll talk some more about this on Thursday. And then importantly, on December 3rd, yeah, all of your work must be handed in of the end of December 3rd. You cannot come in on December 4th due to government guidelines and restrictions. Please, if you need any time, if your project has really fallen through, hand in what you have and do other work and present other things digitally, but I need to have a portfolio with your carousel work at least in your sketchbook. So please pass that in. If you're self-isolating and unable to come in, please contact me for some alternative submissions. Yeah? If you're worried about getting the work done, please contact me. I'm only expecting for this project a series of experimentations and drawings, not a final epic narrative, yeah? You only have a week and a half to create, and I know what a week and a half's worth of work is. I want you guys to have some fun, make some really interesting experimental pieces. I'm not looking for 26 Ansel Adams-esque portraits of the White Cliffs of Dover. That'd be boring as hell. Try something new. Make something weird. Try something you wouldn't normally do. It doesn't have to be narrative. It doesn't have to tell a story. It just needs to focus on the landscape. Yeah? And I'm ending with Edmund Earle here. Look at how far you can change what the landscape looks like. The landscape in Sleeping Beauty is more interesting than the rotoscoped animation on top of it. So maybe it's about just a series of some of the most stunning, beautiful background paintings you guys can make. Maybe it's just a quick little animation. Maybe it's just a lovely, slow shot of the sun setting on a gorgeous November evening. Yeah, think about what you can capture in this time and try your best to try and do something that works outside of your comfort zone. Yeah? If you have any questions, please email me. I'm here to help. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I hope you really enjoy this project.